Hey, how you doing? It's Des Clark here, and I have been part of many a Hit Scotland event over the past few years, and I know as you do what a tough year or so it's been for everyone involved in the hospitality industry. That's why the Recipe for Recovery webinars have been such a success, and may I use the pun hit for many people. There you go, I've still got it, and I hope you enjoy this one as a way to bounce back, to recover, to go forward, and at some point soon get to this new normal that we keep talking about. Enjoy the webinar.
The fourth Hit Scotland webinar, and it's Recipe for Recovery, of course, our main theme throughout all of these webinars. I am Jennifer Riek, and I'm delighted to be back with you live from the Hilton here in Glasgow over the next hour. Now, obviously, we have got the main topic today is the environment, but we're obviously following that theme of recovery as well, as all the hospitality businesses across Scotland are bouncing back, ready to take on what hopefully is the light at the end of the tunnel of this pandemic over the last year. Now, we've had 3 fantastic weeks already, some brilliant speakers, and if you have missed any of them, or you just want to go back and watch them again, you can do. They're going to be on the Hit Scotland website, and I think you can find them on the Hit Scotland Instagram as well. So feel free to have a wee look at them in your own time. Obviously though, we've got a live hour ahead of us now, and we have got 2 fascinating speakers for you, promising you a fantastic hour ahead. Hopefully they will motivate, inspire and give a great insight into their worlds. And the good news keeps coming as well. Of course, this is a free webinar at Hit Scotland. Very keen to provide these webinars to help the industry all across the country, for everyone really. It is hopefully something there for you all. Hopefully inspiring and supporting and providing training for the hospitality industry, which is fantastic. So a good hour ahead of us. To formally introduce us though to the session is Hit Scotland's Chief Executive, a man with passion, dedication, and now with an MBE for Services to Hospitality. It is the lovely David Cochrane. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here again. And as you said, I can't believe they're at week 4 already. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. The numbers seem to have gone up week after week, and I think that's the calibre of the speakers, and not least again today, as you've mentioned, we've got 2 fantastic speakers. Thanks very much to Paul Bray and his excellent committee that have managed to put these the whole themes together. And I think today it's just lovely being out again in the fine surroundings of the Glasgow Hilton. The technical guys have done a great job. The coverings of the wall look fantastic. And like everybody, looking forward to hearing 2 dynamic speakers, because at the end of the day, the environment and all the aspects of the environment are key to our recovery. So looking forward to the speakers.
Thank you very much, David. Great to be back here, as you said, in the Hilton and in person. It's lovely, it really is. Now, we want to obviously say thank you to all of our sponsors, because without them it just wouldn't be possible to put on these webinars. So thank you so much to Skills Development Scotland, Vision Events Glasgow, Red Unit, Recruit Genie and Hilton Hotels. A massive big thank you to all of them. And as I mentioned, our webinars are completely free. They have been for the last 3 weeks. They'll continue to be for the next couple after today. If you do want to support Hit Scotland though, and you are able, you can donate £10 by texting HITSCOT, that's HITSCOT, it's on the screen below here, all the details, to 785, that's 70085. If you want to support Hit Scotland, all the money raised will go towards our resilience scholarships as well, to help those adversely affected by the pandemic. So a very worthwhile cause, no pressure, but if you can support us, then we'd love for you to text HITSCOT to 785. Right, we're going to get straight into our speakers for today. We're going to hear from Gordon Dewar, the CEO of Edinburgh Airport, who is sitting to my left at the moment. We'll hear from him very shortly. But first, we're going to head over to the wonderful Andy Pagg. Now, Andy is the eco-adventurer and BBC reporter who has spent 2 years driving around the world in an old school bus. He salvaged from a scrapyard, powered by cooking oil, honestly it's amazing, and turned into a home using reclaimed materials. He's an engineer and award-winning investigative journalist, but his spirit of adventure led to 12 years of heading up vehicle-based expeditions to remote parts of Africa and the Sahara Desert, until he was inspired to change the elements of his life that were unsustainable, which led him to experiment with alternative ways of powering his his overland journeys. It's very, very interesting. Andy's going to explore how experimental eco-adventure has taken him closer to understanding exactly what sustainability really means and ever more clues on how to achieve it. I am so excited to hear him speak. What an incredible adventure he's been on. And we're going to welcome now Andy Pagg. Andy, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. What a lovely introduction. That's very kind. Thank you.
Well, we're delighted that you could join us. You have a very glamorous backdrop, and this is not a green screen, is it? Where are you?
It's not. I was saying if I smile and my teeth become transparent, you'll know that this is fake. No, I'm actually in Crotone in Calabria in southern Italy. It's the instep of Italy, if you like, and this is Kushla Namara, our sailing boat. Julie, my wife, is on board. And this is a boat that we bought with the intention of converting it to an ocean-going boat. So we spent 4 months in Greece refitting it. And now we're starting our journey westward. And the intention is to allow university researchers to come and use it as a platform to do various types of research as they go. And it's kind of one of the themes I'm probably going to touch on as we go along. This idea of traveling with a purpose helps make that travel sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds so exciting. I am not going to talk anymore. The platform is entirely yours, Andy. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. Well, listen, I hope you can all see the slides on the screen there. I'd rather ambitiously, I thought, well, let's do this outside because it's a lovely day. And that was about an hour ago when I set up, and now it's looking a little bit grey. And the light, hopefully you can, I don't look like I'm a sort of a whistleblower on Panorama that's obfuscated, but so hopefully you can see me and the slides. So this, I'm going to show you basically a load of photographs from different trips and travels that I've done and explain my attempts to travel sustainably and how the thinking behind those trips has evolved over the years. So this was probably one of the most ambitious trips. As you heard, they're trying to drive around the world in this truck, which I got from a scrapyard and ran on waste cooking oil that I scavenged along the journey all the way around the world, 2 years. This is the reason we're 200 feet, is 100 feet below sea level, is because we're in Death Valley here. That's Christina, my former partner, and that's me there with the snorkel on upside down. And so I just to introduce myself, I'm an engineer by training, journalist by profession, but I've also had, I'm kind of jack of all trades. I've got a friend with an MBA that says I should describe myself as having a portfolio career, which sounds a lot better than jack of all trades. But I've been a tour guide. I used to take American tourists around Europe on coach tours. I've been a secondhand car dealer. I've been a filmmaker, various other things. And thanks to this trip and other ones like it, I often get called an environmentalist, which is a term that kind of doesn't really sit right with me because it immediately conjures up this kind of do-gooder vibe of like, oh, he's just going to make me feel guilty about driving the car and, you know, these bloody tree huggers. This is a picture of me hugging a tree, in fairness. This is from one of the trips I did through Angola. And this is a quiver tree. And the way they spread their seeds, they kind of end up growing very much on their own. They don't grow in copse. And so they kind of look a little bit lonely and they're just the right height to hug a tree. But apart from this one instance of tree hugging, it's not this idea of environmentalism. It's not something that kind of resonates with me. It's something I get a little bit uncomfortable with when I'm associated with that. Actually, my background that led to trying to do these sustainable trips came from the fact that I was buying cars in Germany, usually without an MOT or a TÜV, as they call it in Germany, TÜV, and then transporting them, driving them across Europe, down through Morocco, Mauritania, and to Senegal. So having an amazing adventure crossing the Sahara on the way. But actually, what I discovered after the first trip I did is that the cars were worth more in West Africa because they weren't worried about the sort of technical MOT failure. They were able to cobble together things that were broken and keep them running. And you bring a car down to the Gambia or to Senegal, and someone will buy that car and turn it into a taxi, and it provides a sort of livelihood. So there's a more valuable, the sort of things that we considered waste in Europe are kind of more valuable in West Africa. So I would load these cars up with pumps and fridges and generators and truck tires that you can see here. This photograph's from a trip across the Algerian desert. And every trip I did, I kind of went different ways. And it was traveling with a purpose because I was taking this stuff and I would sell it. I wouldn't make a huge amount of money, but I'd pay enough to cover the cost of the journey and the flight home and to start again. So I wasn't kind of making big profits, but it paid for the journey, allowed me to travel. And there was a sense of sustainability, at least in my mind. Didn't really think of it in those terms, in the term sustainability. This is like in the early 2000s. But in my mind, I was kind of putting this waste to good use by taking it somewhere where it was valuable and worthwhile having. Here's another photograph from a different trip. This is a 25-year-old Land Cruiser. So I've had kind of terrible vehicles throughout my life. I really have a kind of passion for terrible vehicles. We drove this 25-year-old Land Cruiser from London to Cape Town. Here we are in Gabon on a logging road, very, very slippery mud in the wet season. These logging trucks have fallen off to the left, one to the right, and we're trying to slime our way through the mud as we go. And one of the reasons that I've always loved overland travel is that you get to see how the world changes in small increments. So you start off in Croydon, which is where I used to live, and then you travel across to France, where things are a little bit different, but you still have a sense of, you know, where your connection is. And then Spain, different again, Morocco, different again. But all the time you have a sense of reference of how you progressed, and suddenly you end up in the rainforest in Gabon. Couldn't be more different from Croydon. And yet you have a sense of, yeah, this is my world. This is the world that we are all part of. And I get how where I'm from is connected to where this place is. And it's very different from, let's say you get on a plane from London and land in Gabon, and everything instantly feels alien and foreign, and you feel a disconnect, and there's an otherness to it. So that's why I've always loved overland travel. Obviously, when you're traveling overland in vehicles like this, there's a certain hypocrisy there, that you're traveling to discover the world. You know, this kind of sort of anthropologist kind of, oh, let's figure out how the world works. But at the same time, you're pumping out all these fumes that are helping to contribute to the destruction of the world. And that was an irony that was lost on me for a long time, until around 2005. This is a photograph, probably one of the ugliest photographs I've got in my collection here, but it's quite significant for me. So this is a photograph in 2005 in Mali. Mali is one of the biggest countries, not the biggest, but one of the biggest countries in West Africa. It's pretty much all desert. There's one road that goes 1,000 kilometers from east to, actually, I think it's 2,000 kilometers from east to west. Back in 2005, it was a single track. And these buses travel up and down the road, and they are the lifeblood of the small villages like this one where I was stopped along the way. And in 2005, crude oil prices had hit $100 a barrel, and that had had a direct relationship on the cost of diesel at the pump in Mali. It was a very direct relationship, and as a result, the buses were more expensive. There were fewer people on the buses. So when these buses pull up, and what's happening here, this bus is overheated, so it stopped for a while in a little village. All the ladies from the village run out with their yams and their cassava and their bags of water that they've made, and sell it. And it's a way of getting produce from their village into the towns, and money from the towns back into the villages. So actually the real economic lifeblood. And I was looking at this as I was sitting on the bonnet of my big 4x4 3-litre diesel engine, thinking, I'm part of that supply demand curve that is causing crude oil to be at $100 a barrel. And me driving around in these big gas guzzly vehicles is having a small part, but nonetheless playing a part in the role that's making these women poorer because there are fewer buses traveling. So what can I do about that? And that was really the kernel of my decision to try and travel sustainably. At that point, I wasn't really worried about carbon footprints and carbon emissions. It was more about the equitable use of resources around the world. So me, as someone coming from a rich country, what can I do to travel in a way that's sustainable in the sense of fairly using the resources that the world has? I've already been thinking about sustainability in the sense of economically sustainable. Can I make enough money out of this trip to then, fly home and do it again? And sustainable in the sense of taking rubbish from one place and bringing it somewhere useful. But here's another kind of way of thinking about sustainability. So back in 2005, I started looking into biodiesel, which was this sort of, at the time, was going to be this wonderful thing that changed the world. Crude oil, or the diesel that you buy at the petrol pump mostly, is made from crude oil, which is under the ground, load of carbon atoms in there. You dig them up, turn it into fuel, you burn it, and those carbon atoms that were once in the ground get released. The difference with biodiesel is that it's made from vegetable oil instead of crude oil. So the vegetable oil comes from seeds, and those seeds absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. And when you burn the fuel, it puts those same carbon atoms back into the atmosphere. So in theory, you're just recycling the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. That's the theory of it. Sounds great. Actually, in practice, there are a load of issues to do with when you're creating agrofuels. Don't have time to go into that, but happy actually to talk about it. And I don't want to brush over it. Happy to talk about it, and if you have any questions about that afterwards. But what I was doing is using waste oil. So here's oil that's already been made, used for cooking. and we're turning that into biofuel. And the sort of interesting part of this little circular diagram is this bit here. That's the CO2 being recycled. Fascinating subject, the kind of the sustainability of biodiesel or not. But anyway, at the time, this kind of felt like, all right, this is the solution that's going to stop me. I'm still at this stage, I'm not too worried about the carbon dioxide, but this is a solution that's going to stop me buying crude oil and driving the price up to $100 a barrel and making those ladies in Mali a little bit poorer. So went back home to the UK, found a company in Preston that were making biodiesel out of waste oil. And they were just at the right moment, they were making biodiesel out of waste chocolate, which I didn't know there was such a thing as waste chocolate, but they were connected with a local factory that was, for whatever reason, had spoils either out of date or had been contaminated in some way. And chocolate, like oil, well, in fact, chocolate is a fat. So like oil is just like an oil, but it's solid instead of liquid. And you can put that through a process called transesterification, basically, and you turn it into a substitute fuel like diesel, which will run in a diesel engine. I thought, brilliant, this is it. They gave me 2,000 litres of the stuff, and I thought, I'm going to try and drive to Timbuktu, which is in Mali, incidentally. And it's, you know, famous for being the most remote place that you could ever get to. A lot of people think actually it's a made-up place, but no, it is a real town. And surprising, it might surprise you to know that you can drive most of the way to Mali on road. Pretty bad, broken up road, but on road. But the last 200 kilometers are soft sands, proper like kind of, you know, like you imagine the Sahara Desert is all sand dunes going over soft sand. Very, very difficult to drive. So got to carry the fuel with me. So this was my setup. I've got a truck here that can carry the weight of the fuel, and it can also carry a four-wheel drive vehicle that allows me to do the last part of the journey. I couldn't carry all the fuel in just a four-wheel drive vehicle to travel the 3,000 kilometers to where the road ends. So I had this set up. I bought this truck. This truck, again, my penchant for terrible vehicles. The guy that sold me this truck had actually already sold it to someone else who got the money for it. The guy had come to look at it and said, I don't want it, and walked away from it. And he sold it to me for 500 quid. And the two four-wheel drives, one was used in a smash and grab raid. I bought it from the police for scrap value. And the other one had a fuel cell. Basically, I kind of put the first one on and I thought, I think there's space for a second one. And I managed to find this second one in a scrapyard. It had a fuel starvation problem, which, because I know these engines quite well, I was able to fix. Anyway, so there I go, set off on this with this charabang of scrap metal to drive to Timbuktu with sustainable fuel. I had some experts do the maths, and they figured that actually, if I stayed at home and did nothing, I would actually emit more carbon dioxide than I would by doing this trip. So they called the trip carbon negative. And there's interesting, again, I kind of have mixed emotions about this kind of idea of accounting for carbon. And when you hear the term carbon negative, net zero, all these things, they always come with a little bit of interpretation. And I'm not always kind of, I used to brag about the fact that this was the first ever carbon neutral trip to Timbuktu. I don't really like to talk about that anymore, because I think it just depends on how you do the maths on the carbon. Anyway, what could possibly go wrong? Chocolate powered fuel all the way to Timbuktu. Well, first of all, we set off thinking we're going to the desert. So shorts and t-shirts, we set off driving. This is November. We get to the Pyrenees and the truck gets really cold going over the Pyrenees, and it conks out, and we realize the fuel filters are blocked. So we pull the fuel filters on, put them back, fresh set on, carry on, truck conks out again. Well, it can't be the fuel filters because we just changed them. We spent 2 days really, really cold, sleeping in the cab, not thinking straight. And eventually we realized that the fuel was basically turning back into chocolate in the fuel filters. It was so cold. So once we figured that out, we kind of managed to warm the filters up as we were driving, came down out of the Pyrenees. And that was the first kind of big milestone, a big kind of hurdle. The next one was when we got to Morocco. We crossed the border into Morocco, and they say, "What's this 2,000 litres of liquid that you've got there?" And we're like, "Well, you know, we are environmentalists. We're saving the world. You know, it's a new kind of fuel." And they say, "Okay, fuel. Well, 2,000 litres. You need to pay this much import tax for the fuel." And we're like, "No, we can't afford that. It's not really fuel. It's a waste product." It's a waste product, therefore we don't have to. Okay, well, it's a waste product. Where do you have your waste licenses to show that you're going to transport this through our country and not just dump it in the desert? So, oh, we don't have any of that. And eventually, I kind of came around to saying, okay, it's actually chocolate. It's a form of chocolate, and the way this all took a week. And what you're looking at here is my co-driver John waiting out that week in the Tangier ferry port. So comfortable were we that you can see in the bottom here is that my hammock hanging between our truck and the truck next to us, because we basically set up a little encampment there because we weren't allowed to travel any further. Anyway, after a week, I persuaded them that if I drink this stuff, then that somehow proves that it's chocolate, and they'd let us go. And I've got to tell you, this stuff, it tastes like emulsion paint. It's horrible. Anyway, we get through that border, carry on to the next border, which is Mauritania. And here I had the bright idea of persuading the customs officers to drink the fuel rather than me. And miraculously, they didn't lock me up. But anyway, we got through that border. So the whole trip was going to take 3 weeks, ended up taking 4 weeks. But we did it. We got to Timbuktu. Here we are with John. He's trying to dress like a Tuareg, who's one of the men of the desert with his shesh. I think he looks more like an outpatient from the head injuries unit. And I thought, listen, this sustainable fuel, it does work. It's a good way to travel. By then, I was kind of switching on to carbon footprints. But it's not particularly practical to carry all that fuel with you in one go, because you have to take a truck and all the rest of it. But is there an infrastructure of waste oil that we can use around the world? And I came up with the idea of doing a rally from London to Athens using the chip shops of Europe to fuel the journey. I called it the Greece to Greece rally. See what I did there? So again, using waste oil, this time, instead of turning the waste oil into biodiesel, converting the engines so that they can run on the waste oil. And the only thing you have to do really is filter the oil. Actually, it's a bit more complicated than that, and you need to use old diesel engines. And this is where we started from, the Ace Cafe in London. We, at that time, were kind of popping a little bit of a snook at the big fuel companies, so you can be sure of shallow fried, beyond pie and mash, and put a kebab in your tank, no fish and chips left in the van overnight. So we were kind of like ribbing the fuel companies a little bit at the time. There was a little bit of greenwashing starting to creep into their messaging, so we just wanted to sort of try and highlight that. But what I love about this trip is that we all turned up. I got 10 cars, a group of friends, different friends that all came along and came along for the ride. And at the beginning, none of us had any idea how we were going to do this. This is around the back of the Ace Cafe in London, where we started from. And what's great about this photograph, if you look, there's like actually six people, the person taking the photograph, gathered around here because we've got this big vat of oil, used disgusting oil. I'm in my best trainers, and we're trying to figure out how to get the oil out without shaking it up so it doesn't get all the gunk at the bottom. And anyway, one guy had a pump, one guy had a bit of tubing, and someone else volunteered to suck on the end of the hose to get a siphon going. And by hook or by crook, over the next 10 days, we managed to make it to Athens. There's a Greek temple in the background to prove we made it. And we even got invited to meet the British ambassador in Athens, who gave us all a lovely bottle of Greek olive oil, which didn't go in the tanks. And I made a joke like, oh, we're meeting the ambassador, we're all going to get Ferrero Rocher. If you look closely in this photograph, you can see that he's giving me a box of Ferrero Rocher, because embarrassingly, he read my blog and went out and got some Ferrero Rocher. Anyway, while I was on that trip, I was thinking, look, there was a point somewhere in Albania where the road sign said Athens, 400 kilometers, something like that. And I did the maths on how much oil we had left. And I thought, oh, we've got enough fuel. We've done it. All we've got to do is drive now. We don't have to collect any more fuel out of the bins. Job done. And on that sign as well, it said Istanbul, about the same distance, 400 odd kilometers. And I thought, well, Istanbul is the gateway to Asia. It's where Europe stops and Asia starts. Maybe we could have, instead of going to Athens, we could have said we're going to Asia. Maybe we could drive through it. Maybe we could drive around the world. So that's where the idea started. Obviously, to drive around the world, you'd need a very, very special vehicle. Here's the one I chose. And this is after I've been working on it for a couple of weeks. So again, Preston, great place to go to buy terrible vehicles. I don't know why, but I bought this in Preston, went up. The guy was about to scrap it. So I bought it off him for less than scrap value, because I argued that he wouldn't have to put diesel in it to take it to the scrap yard. And he let me have it for even less. So I'm driving it down to Sussex. A friend of mine's got a barn there. I'm going to work on it, and I'm going to drive it around the world. And he said, oh, I don't fancy your chances. I won't do the Preston accent. And I said, oh, really? You don't think it'll make it around the world? He said, no, I don't think it'll make it to Sussex. Anyway, it did. I spent 4 months working on it. I had a friend that fitted this amazing oil filtering system under the bed, a huge tank, 1,000-litre tank, so I could fill up wherever I could find stuff, and then that would give me a buffer to keep going. I put solar panels on the roof, so my life inside the van was sustainable. And as I say, after about 4 months of working on it, it was ready to set off to go around the world, setting off from Greenwich here. And one of the things I did along the way was I took my paraglider. So a paraglider is it's like a parachute, but it's shaped like a wing. You run off a hill, and use the thermals to float around in the sky. If you're good, you can stay in the air literally all day long, 8-9 hours, and you can travel hundreds of kilometers. I'm not that good, but people do. And everywhere I went along this journey around the world, I'd stop at paragliding clubs, and I'd latch on with other pilots, and we'd all go flying together. And one of the recurring memories, this is back in 2009, 2010, one of the recurring messages that I got from them was, there's something really weird happening with the weather. Either normally it's really good at this time of year, but now it's terrible, or normally it's terrible for flying, but now it's really good. And there was a real sense that the weather was doing something different. And these are paraglider pilots who are very attuned to the weather. And also when you're flying, you land in fields because that's where you land. You haven't really got a choice. And the farmers usually come out because they're curious what the hell's going on. And then you start chatting. And then again, a resounding message that the farmers were telling is, yeah, the weather's doing something really funny. And again, these are people that are attuned to the weather and keeping track of it. So in 2009, 2010, I started to think, yeah, there really is a problem with a changing climate here. People who are attuned to the weather are really seeing it. And at that point, I kind of felt like, yeah, this journey, it's a bit silly, it's a bit quirky, but actually there's a real sense of, can this technology of using waste oil, can it actually be a useful thing? I suppose we're at a point now, sort of coming out of COVID, hopefully that we are, where there's a real opportunity. I'm kind of conscious that as an environmentalist, that term I don't like, people point the finger at me and say, oh, you love this because all you want is for everyone to be miserable in order to save the polar bears, which is, I mean, I don't think people are quite that simplistic about it anymore, but that certainly was a kind of rhetoric in the past. And I think the problem with sort of COVID as a solution to climate change is that the massive changes that we've seen at the moment are great in terms of we're using less carbon emissions over the last 18 months. But in reality, those are a pause in our behavior. They're not a change in our behavior. And also they've highlighted the scale of behavior change that we would need in order to make significant reductions in CO2. So I think if the COVID crisis has taught us anything in terms of CO2 sustainability, is that actually this is really, really difficult. On the plus side, I think it's turned people on to the idea that actually the human animals are not immune to the natural world and its effect. When I was doing this trip, mostly it was through developing countries, and there was a sense in my head, again, that this was an issue about social justice. So the climate change effects that we were seeing in 2009, I think were more geared toward, it's the Bangladeshi farmer, it's the Indian rice farmer. These are the people that are going to suffer. And we in the wealthy countries have a responsibility to use the resource of the atmosphere in which we pump our waste CO2 responsibly, because we have an obligation to those people. Now, I think we're in a very different situation where we're starting to see, regular flooding in the UK. This is a rich country with amazing infrastructure. In the US, we're seeing fires on the West Coast on an annual basis. We're seeing hurricane seasons that are causing flooding in the south of the US. Last year, the fires in Australia, absolutely unprecedented scale. So even rich, wealthy countries now, I think are at threat from this crisis. And maybe the COVID crisis has taught us, maybe given us some kind of template or outlook of how we need to behave. Because when you say, oh yeah, there's been a climate crisis, actually none of the steps we've taken towards addressing the climate crisis look anything like the incredible steps we've taken to addressing the COVID crisis. So I think there are some positive things, and I think we are coming out of the COVID crisis with an opportunity now, something that in 10 years environmental or 20 years environmental movement hasn't really done, which is to present an alternative. And this idea of a green economy, the Green New Deal, it's saying that we can change how we do things to make the world more sustainable. And that will also make our lives better now. We can create new types of jobs and new things. And I think for the travel industry, that's a really, really interesting challenge of thinking about what it is that people really want from travel, whether it's self-affirmation, whether it's some sort of personal growth, whether it's to just have a nice drink somewhere pretty. How can you provide those core fundamental desires in a way that is more sustainable? And how can you provide them in a way that they have a purpose? So it's not just, well, I just want to sit on a beach and get tanned, but how can I use that travel to do something a little bit more so that there's a validity to the inevitable lack of sustainability that comes with jumping on a plane or traveling far away for essentially leisure purposes. Anyway, that's my little preachy bit there. Let me finish off telling you about how we're doing for time, a little bit over. Let me tell you just to finish off about the trip and how it went, because there's this is the route here. So we went down through Europe and into Turkey and Iran and Baluchistan, the southern part of Pakistan, which at the time was a sort of pseudo war zone with Al Qaeda blowing up fuel trucks, and it was quite a dangerous part. India, where, very long story here, I got arrested, ended up spending 6 months for having a satellite phone. And then during the journey as well, you can see I had to ship the truck 3 times. So it went on a container ship, and I had to fly a couple of those times. The last time I managed to actually hitch a ride on a container ship as well. So not completely without its carbon footprint, this journey. You know, there were some compromises made along the way. But I'm going to give you the 3 key takeaways that I learned from this trip that you might like to use when you're traveling around the world, or even when you're thinking about how to create a more sustainable ways of working in your businesses. So the first one is get a really long hose. So here I am in Texas outside a fuel station, and I'm actually filling up from the bins next to the diner. And it's only because I had a 10-meter hose that I was able to get through the grill and fill up, and it made life easy. So the message here is get the right tools, the right resources, the right people around you. The tools can be people, resources, and the right environment, positive environment that allows you to try something different. Stay warm is the second message. This is in the back streets of Tehran, where I stayed. Incredible hospitality there. I was only going to stay for a couple of weeks. I ended up staying for 6 weeks and extending my visa. Met some people there. They just looked after me, and actually they gave me an apartment to live in. And so the van stayed on the street, and it looks sunny, and I'm in shorts, but actually this is November, really, really cold. And the truck was on the shady side of the street, so it got progressively colder over the days. When I eventually went to start it, the same thing had happened with those fuel filters, but the fuel had clogged all the lines, and there was no way to get it running. Thankfully, the Iranians had a clamp down on satellite dishes, so everyone had taken their satellite dishes down off the wall and thrown them out. And I grabbed one, got some barbecue charcoal, and if you look back at this photograph, you can see that actually under the van, I'm barbecuing the engine in order to warm it up, melt the biodiesel, or use cooking oil in order to get the engine running. That's why I'm looking so perturbed there. Maybe a broader lesson here is, don't be afraid to try really crazy stuff. Obviously do it cautiously. I'm just left it to roast there. I'm fretting about it. But be prepared to try really kind of alternative, radical solutions, and don't be afraid to fail. I think failure is really underrated. This could, I might not be saying that if the truck had caught fire, but anyway, just as a general rule, I love giving these talks because I get to sound like amazing. Yeah, I've done all these amazing, incredible, successful things. I could give much longer talks about all the things that I've tried and failed at. And the final lesson is, people are on your side. People are your best support. This is in Baluchistan. This is inside the truck here. You can see what it looks like driving through Baluchistan, which was a kind of war zone. And I got a military escort, and I had a car in front of me at certain points as well, where it was thought to be dangerous, so that they were protecting me. And every country I went to where I thought, oh God, here is where I'm going to get strung up from a lamppost, without fail, was the countries where people were really, really friendly. They really got behind the idea of trying to help me find waste oil. And again, traveling with this purpose helped me kind of get those better connections with people than I would have been if I'm just like, yeah, I'm just here to take a few photographs of your monuments and your tourist sites. I'm just gonna, I guess, so the trip ended up taking 2 years. I'd hoped it would take a year, but that's the beauty of these journeys. They never go according to plan. Here's a photograph from one of the paragliding takeoffs above Tehran. I got to fly my paraglider over Tehran city, which was amazing. I thought I'd be arrested for it, but and one of the things you can see there is just the haze of pollution. And driving around the world, you actually get a sense of the scale, the physical size of the world, and how many people there are on it, and how many trucks there are, and how many of those trucks are old and pumping out really black, horrible fumes, and just how difficult it is to move to a sustainable form of transportation. So this trip that I did, it worked for me. I was able to travel relatively sustainably. I did all of the 35,000 miles using nothing but waste cooking oil. I was really meticulous about that. I did buy about 20 litres of diesel to clean out filters and various other things. But on the whole, I think it's fair to say that the trip was sustainable. As I said before, I had to fly a couple of times, so that kind of really knocks the carbon footprint up. But I also learned other lessons in sustainability, which I hadn't expected, which was that living in a van, eating food that you collect sort of locally that doesn't have a lot of food miles, is actually a really sustainable way to live, slightly hermetic, but there are elements of that which have stayed with me ever since. Very final photograph I want to leave you with. So this is, again, another paragliding takeoff site in Panjgani, northern Italy. And it's quite an affluent tourist town. And on the edge of the town, near the paragliding takeoff, was this makeshift camp of these ethnicity, which is kind of low-caste ethnicity, is kind of living, as you can see, very rough conditions on the edge of town. And I was looking at this scene and I was thinking, oh, look, they're like me. They've used waste materials for their home. Oh, and they're cooking on wood, which is a biofuel. Oh, just like me. Oh, aren't these people great? And they have these donkeys that they use as they're sort of bicycle couriers, but they're donkey couriers around the town. That's how they make money. And the donkeys eat food scraps, so that's energy transport from waste as well. Oh, wouldn't it be great if everybody lived like this? I was thinking on one side of my brain. And instantly you think, well, actually, no, the reason why we need to make those changes to our carbon emissions is so that people aren't forced to migrate and end up living like this. And I think in that sort of schizophrenic moment of thinking about this scene in two different ways, I think get back to this idea of what is an environmentalist. And I think an environmentalist is someone who thinks that our quality of life as a whole, as a species, is best ensured and guaranteed by thinking about how we use resources and rationing them appropriately, as opposed to someone who thinks that actually our quality of life is most threatened by rationing those resources. So in that definition, and I come back to this idea of being a tree hugging environmentalist. And I think if that's the definition, then I have to admit that I am an environmentalist. But I think probably most people watching would probably like to think of themselves as environmentalists as well, thinking that actually the best way of securing our quality of life is thinking about and possibly rationing our uses of resources, and that includes the atmosphere as a resource to put our carbon emissions in. I feel bad because I've kind of talked a little bit over my time, and I'm really, really interested to hear what Gordon has to say. So I will leave it there, but I hope there's going to be some questions as well. Please don't pull your punches with the questions. If there's something I've said that you really disagree with, really, really keen to hear that. Thank you.
Andy, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. You might recognise, I don't know if you can kind of see in the background, we've been inspired by your journey, and we've managed to create a graphic of your very own van. It's quite good. It's in the back. It's now surrounding us actually here in the Hilton in Glasgow. So we feel like we're a wee bit on your journey as well. It's great fun.
That's great. I love it.
Thank you so much. That was really, really insightful. And as Andy said there, if you do have any questions for him, he's going to hang around, and the same as Gordon in our studio. We're going to call it a studio, sounds more fancy. Gordon's going to hang around as well. So any questions that you do have, please put them into, we've got sort of a Q&A box, we've got a chat box. I've got access to both of them on the laptop beside me here. We've actually got a question in from Iris already, so please keep them coming in, and we will deal with the Q&A section a wee bit later on. So thank you once again to Andy. And from a man who loves overland travel, we're going to air travel now. Our second speaker today is the brilliant Gordon Dewar, and we're delighted he joined us here actually in person as well, which is brilliant. Gordon took up the post of Chief Executive at Edinburgh Airport in July 2012, with the airport experiencing 63% growth in passengers from 9 million to 14.7 million passengers in 2009, which is a record for any Scottish airport. Gordon has worked tirelessly to steer the airport through the COVID-19 pandemic, ensuring it stayed open throughout and diversifying the approach as well. Gordon spent 4 years with BAA running Glasgow and Edinburgh airports from 2007 to 2010, and he spent 2 years as Chief Executive at Bahrain International Airport, creating an independent and profitable business for the first time after a carve-out from the government. He is a board member of the Scottish Tourism Alliance and has been awarded many accolades. I could be here all day telling you about them, but we're going to let him speak to you instead to tell you a bit about his incredible career and his thoughts, obviously, on the environment. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's good afternoon to everybody. It's great to be here. I mean, I can't explain how excited I am about just getting out of the house, out of the empty airport terminal, actually getting on my motorbike and coming across out of Edinburgh for the first time in about 7 months, I think.
Well, we're taking you back to the airport.
Yeah, no, it's exactly. Well, there's more planes than that, and there is at the airport at the moment. So there we are. But And in fact, the last time I was in this room, I was doing a charity Strictly Come Dancing competition, where I have to say, thankfully, my fundraising skills were better than my dancing skills. So, but look, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about this, because I think actually the conversation will be even more interesting. But I want to be able to try and talk a little bit about the business side of the recovery, but also how it interacts with the environmental stuff that Andy's been talking about and is so close to our hearts as well. And it might be surprising to hear that somebody from aviation relishes that sustainability challenge, because I think we're often painted as the sort of the fifth horseman of the apocalypse in the carbon agenda. And there's a few things that I think are always sort of watchwords. There's a number of phrases that come out of the swirling discussions that are all about the recovery, the sustainability agenda, the zero carbon targets that I think are really worth giving some consideration to. And I think Andy kind of hits on that. It's about balance. It's about how do these things actually work in the long run. Sustainability is more than carbon. It's about genuinely, can we keep doing this and not be wasting resource or destroying resource. So what I will say is my position is probably pretty anti-populist. In the sense that I think there are genuinely lots of nuances and implications and difficult choices to make. So if you're hoping for a sort of single issue simplicity, you probably want to cancel me now, because that's not what I'm going to offer. And one of the examples is, everyone keeps using this phrase, build back better. And who would disagree with that? I mean, that's clearly an ambition that we could all sign up to. But deciding what is better is no easier now than it was in the past, because I don't think people were previously deciding to carry on worse. That wasn't what we were doing. So there were difficult choices then, there are difficult choices now. And I think Andy's point about how we've maybe had a different context and a different spectrum on it is really interesting. And I think there's also another one about this equitable transition. Again, you see examples from Andy's work about people that are living in shacks and so on, and people living in poverty in other parts of the world. And clearly, again, it's an objective we can all sign up to, because it's sort of fairly straightforward. But it can't be just about virtue signalling. It can't be about doing things that make it look good but actually achieve nothing in the home. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we come to the agenda, particularly as a rich country, about our own attitude to carbon reduction, carbon zero, I think leadership is everything. I would argue that if we want to be good leaders in this, we need to do things that others will want to follow. And what I mean by that is it would be better, I think, for Scotland to find a quick and rapid 20% reduction in carbon. I'm just plucking numbers from the air, but doing it in a way that the rest of the world will want to copy, because if China copy us, there's a big impact. Rather than say, well, let's do something that cuts our carbon output by 90%, but do it in a way that destroys the economy, damages life, doesn't address the equity issue where poorer people suffer more, for example, and nobody will follow it. So it will be a hollow victory in the sense that we'll have achieved nothing on a world scale, but potentially done ourselves undoubted damage. But before we go on to that, and I'll come back to the carbon thing, but we've got to be around to play our part. We've got to survive this COVID crisis. So I want to spend a little bit of time and hopefully something relevant for all of the working in hospitality and any businesses. And I know that flying, you can't take the lazy position if you work in hospitality or tourism that flying is bad, or more often what you hear is people saying other people flying is bad. Well, you know the value of travel, you know about access to learning, you know about business and innovation connections, visiting friends and family, which we've all missed doing over the last year, cultural exchange, which I would argue is actually quite important to avoid war, for example, and of course tourism and the jobs and value that sustains. Now, those celebrating the drop in aviation numbers, as I've seen people talking about, should go and express that happiness in the hotel owner in the Highlands and Islands, or go and share their delight with those that are performers and artists that have got no audiences to play to. Or more importantly, talk to anybody that's just employed in tourism and see just how happy they are and see if that feels sustainable and equitable change for those people. I don't think they'll find a particularly willing audience. So anyway, what do we do about it? How are we going to come out the other side of this? Well, there's three sort of points I want to make about, I think, are generally good approaches for business. The first one is be ready to respond. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the one thing we do know is that we don't know how this recovery is going to be. There's so many other variables are coming at us. Travel policy is the one that's impacting my industry so significantly, where there's actually travel bans or border restrictions. We still don't know how we're going to track our way out of that. The Scottish Government at the moment has no plan, so it's quite difficult to predict how that will work. The health position itself, how it will change. Will we get new variants? Will different countries have a different vaccine output? Will we find ways of dealing with that? How will we be expected to deal with social distancing or testing on an ongoing basis? And of course, how do we make all of that work without it becoming a big detraction to the customers themselves? Nobody wants to spend 3 days preparing for a long weekend away. So, and I think the only answer to all of that is you've got to do the scenario planning. And that's just about thinking through what is possible, thinking through that if it goes down that particular direction, what would that mean for the way your business would have to respond? How could you influence some decisions of policymakers? And really do that hard lifting to understand what could be coming at you. And some of these things are more predictable. You know, for example, we knew from day one we were going to have to preserve cash if physically we wanted the business to actually survive this. Now, that's a really tough job, but it's an easy decision in the sense that there is no choice. But of course, that did mean we lost about a third of our colleagues through redundancy, but it was predictable. Less predictable, perhaps, things like testing regimes and technology and how we're going to use all that stuff to make things better for the future. But all of that's true. You can run these scenarios, you look at what it means for your business. And what I think is really striking is that our planning people and our development people, our R&D and researchers have been busier this last year than they've ever been because there's so many variables out there that we have to think about. But that's really the answer, is think about them and be ready to react if you see one of or more of these scenarios coming at you. The second thing I think is about focusing on core strengths. Again, aided by the scenario planning, but this is about knowing what your business, your team, and your market is best at or strongest in. In our world, that's known about how we can show the airlines of the world why Edinburgh and Scotland is a brilliant market to come to. And I could wax lyrical about that, an entire thing, and I won't do that, but rest assured, we present data-driven, really coherent arguments about why Edinburgh has been outperforming the market for the last 8 years and why equally will outperform the recovery as well in terms of the market. So that's really important about giving partners confidence that they should invest again in Scotland in the future. It was about knowing and understanding that our laser focus on cost reduction and productivity is going to be ever more important, and making sure that we can continue doing that. And of course, it was also about relying upon the really hard-won, developed over many years, commercial talent, really strong commercial teams, where if you don't have the volume and you're not going to get the same income per passenger because airlines are wanting everything cheaper and nobody's got any money to spend, we've got to find new revenue streams. So about using that commercial acumen we had to think creatively about how we're going to find new ways of raising revenue from lower volumes. And I think that's just a truism. So they are our three strengths, I would argue with, but every business will have its own strengths. It will have its own marketing, but know what they are, do the work, really do the heavy lifting, but understanding which ones are going to stand you in good stead for the recovery. And then thirdly, I think we have to acknowledge that we're going to have to redefine success and targets, certainly in the short and the medium term. It may take time before, in our world, we're back to 2019 levels of passengers. It may take 5 to 10 years, and profits that go with that. We might have to accept that we will have lower margins and just, swallow hard and get on with it. We're going to have different working relationships with airlines, handling companies, retailers, because the world has changed for them as well. But I think as long as you know what your strategic objectives are, you understand what is success in terms of the broad brush of what we're trying to do, then you can adapt to that new world because because at the end of the day, strategy is just a signpost of where do you go when you've got a decision to make. If we can do that, then I think you put your business, your team in the best place possible to make consistent, sensible decisions around this new environment that we're in and go forward. And nothing could be a better example of that than the low carbon strategy. So, we were facing into this before COVID. It was clear that, aviation has huge challenges, but the rest of the world and business does as well. We were already planning on being a carbon neutral airport in 2021. Some of that was about investment in technology. We were going to, and we will be building a large solar farm for our own energy requirements. We were going to be looking at investing in offsetting through Scottish forestry, through rewilding, so really tangible projects where I know there's mixed views about things like offsetting, but a lot of that is because people don't believe the projects really deliver. We wanted to make sure that not only will there be real project delivering, but they'll all be in Scotland as well. And I believe we would have been ahead of the airport pack if things had gone to plan. I think we still will be. I think we might even have stood out in Scottish business as being a sort of leader in that. But now, not only do we have to be good as an airport, we have to be carbon neutral ourselves to even buy a seat at the table, to get a ticket to the conversation. But I think we have to face in even faster now to the fact that even if the airport is zero carbon, 90% plus of the carbon associated with aviation happens up there, and it's with the airlines. So there's no point in us saying we've solved the problem simply because we're not creating carbon on the ground. But here's a different way of looking at that conversation. Rather than it seem this insurmountable disaster and, will we just give up now? Because partly through necessity, the jobs that we enable, not just in aviation, but everyone relies upon us, but tourism, the largest employer in Scotland, partly through some of the opportunity and the strengths I think the Scottish market has. and partly about just having to get this right. So it's not only the responsible approach, but surely if we really looked into this could be the leadership approach I referred to at the start, doing things in a way for tourism and for wider sectors that actually other parts of the world would want to copy, because we've done it well, we've done it sensibly, and we've done it right. So maybe it is an impossible dream. The fifth horseman of the apocalypse becomes a unicorn. I don't know. I don't think so. And that's a sustainability strategy that supports jobs in tourism. It feels a difficult transition, but I think it is possible. And there's 4 things that I think really paint a picture of why we might be uniquely placed to do that in Scotland. First of all, as a country, people don't realise we've already got a surplus of renewable energy over the piece in Scotland, and that's coming up all the time in terms of offshore, wind in particular, but more and more different methodologies. We have some of the best rewilding and reforesting opportunities across Scotland as well. And again, these are beneficial and sustainable in more than just carbon and the whole way we look at our environment. We've got enormous potential through our universities, through the energy businesses that we've developed through hydrocarbons in the North Sea, but actually huge skill sets that are going to be as relevant for renewable energy as well. And the one thing I think is omitted and not understood, and I think is possibly the best statistic, is an average international tourist coming to Scotland spending a week spends about £600 on their trip with accommodation, travel. Sometimes a lot more, but on average about £600. The cost of the carbon of getting here, on average, again, European thing mostly, but on average, this is the thing, is under a £5. So less than 1% of the value spent, the money spent, is required to offset current carbon costs to do it. So I think that to me is quite a heady mix of a definable problem. What are we trying to fix? We're trying to make tourism sustainable. A surmountable scale of the problem. A £5 doesn't feel impossible to me. And a great array of potential solutions and opportunities, particularly in Scotland, that we could address this. So can we not imagine a future where we make Scotland so attractive for responsible and sustainable tourists, those that actually seek out a sustainable agenda, just as Andy does in his job, but actually want to know they're contributing to the future as well as their own enjoyment? We can capture an extra £5 per visitor. That's all we need to make this work if we're going to invest. We might even create new industries in Scotland on the back of this, or that we have to attract 1% more visitors to pay for that as well. And again, these are sustainable agendas because they support the jobs, they support the economy, they keep the tax base, they allow us to enjoy the other parts of life that we're like. So now that really would be building back better, I think. That really would represent a fair transition towards a carbon-free economy, where we take responsibility for what we're doing. A tourist should come and have a zero carbon footprint. I think that is definable, I think it's achievable, and I think that would be a phenomenal thing for Scotland to shoot for. Thank you.
Brilliant, Gordon, thank you so much. That was a brilliant insight into what hopefully the future of air travel could look like. And as Andy said before, and Gordon, we have now got an opportunity to have a quick sort of Q&A session. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask Gordon, if you want to ask Andy, then please do get involved. Just put them in the chat function or the Q&A function on this webinar. Just move your mouse about and you should get those options at the bottom of the screen. Chuck them in there, get involved in the conversation. Because I do want to go to you first again, Gordon, and just say, do you think this whole last year, the COVID, the pandemic, is going to slow down that progress? Because obviously you said there was aims already there to be sort of more neutral, be working at a sort of a negative carbon footprint in 2021. Has it held us back, do you think?
I think it's stopped us doing specific things. So we haven't built a solar farm or started building a solar farm because instead of having 70 million in profit, we've had 70 million in losses.
Yes.
But that will come back on. I think it's actually will accelerate the need to progress it. And I think it will accelerate the need to get beyond our own airport footprint and actually talk much wider about aviation footprints. So I think it will accelerate that. But inevitably, nothing much is happening in this last year in the aviation world.
Do you think offsetting is the way forward then? Is it about changing fuels? Is it about changing the way we work? Or is it a bit of a balance of both, I suppose?
It's all of the above. So offsetting is buying time. That's all it really is doing. Carbon reduction and not producing it in the first place has got to be the answer. But we're buying time. And it's not necessarily always about things like putting forests, although that's important and a huge opportunity. Yeah. My view is it's about where are you best spending a pound on reducing carbon? And it might be, for example, that instead of us spending, I don't know, £50 saving a tonne in the airport because we're kind of running out of the easy things to do. Maybe we should spend that £50 a tonne on replacing boiler systems in council housing. So it's about looking at that concept of, if there's value to be made here, if we're really interested in the outcome, which is reducing carbon, how do we best spend the money at a Scottish level that says we're playing a role in a way that the rest of the world might actually want to copy?
It's maybe thinking outside that box then, a bigger picture. I mean, something like that, as you said, it wouldn't be the immediate chain of thought to go to maybe there's boiler, maybe there's something else that we can do to have a positive impact.
It's minimising the output that matters. It doesn't matter where the output comes from. This is why us doing something in Scotland around, let's say, aviation tax, that just stops people flying to and from Scotland, will make not a jot of difference if the same planes just fly to Germany instead. Yeah,
absolutely. How do you think the aviation industry, and obviously particularly sort of Edinburgh Airport, has changed over the last 10 to 15 years though? There has been improvements, there has been advances in making sure that there is less carbon footprint. Is that fair to
sure,
say?
yeah. I mean, the carbon per passenger has dropped enormously. What's also happened, of course, is we've grown the number of passengers. So, it is increasing modestly, but there's a whole raft of work that's going on across the industry, largely with the airlines, largely with the engine manufacturers, to look at everything from electric flight. We should have been launching our first electric flight in Venice this year, but again, been deferred by the COVID stuff. There is sustainable fuels from crops coming on stream at the moment. Engine technology is 30% more efficient per kilometre flown. So all of these things are helping, but the industry is going to be one of the slower to completely replace assets such as aircraft because they've got 30-year lifespans. But that's why perhaps us spending our income and some of that investment in other areas first is actually going to give a better return. But I've got absolutely no doubt that we will find carbon-free aviation within a 30 to 40-year horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. I think mentioning of crop fuels is a good time to bring Andy back in. Andy out in his yacht. Hopefully it's still relatively nice and sunny where he is.
Not raining yet.
Yeah, I think he called it a yacht. I think it's a boat. I'm not sure exactly. Catamaran, is that right?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, Andy, what do you think? I want to kind of sort of talk about the emphasis in society, I suppose, on making those positive steps towards a better future. Do you see the climate crisis ever getting the same attention as something like this COVID crisis has had from around the world?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think when I saw that, I just want to start by saying it's a real pleasure to be sort of sharing a bill with Gordon, because it's so interesting what he's saying and actually so inspiring what he's saying. I think of the two of us, I think he's the real environmentalist. And when I sort of saw we were first bill together, I was thinking, I hope they're not looking for a bit of sort of confrontation or alternative viewpoints, because I think we agree on a lot of things there. I think what we've seen as we come out of as we've been through this pandemic is that the scale of the change that's required to bring the emissions down is huge, is vast. If we are just waiting to go back to what we used to do before, then this whole exercise in terms of carbon emissions has been a pause. It hasn't been a change of behaviour, and we're like coil springs ready to go back to the old practices. I think there is going to be a lot of changes, but in quite subtle ways. I think, in fact, I have a question for Gordon. One of the things that I've read about, it seems to be that business travel is really under threat now. As we come out of the pandemic, there's likely to be less and less business travel as businesses have adapted to realise actually we don't need to do that from a cost perspective. And I just wonder it's a question for the whole travel industry, because business travel is such a subsidizer of other forms of the infrastructure that goes around the rest of the travel industry. But I wonder if regional airports have a viable business model if business travel is suddenly decimated, and if there's a business model for regional airports that relies on low volume of passengers.
Good question,
but to come back to answer the question that you asked me, look, I think, like I say, we've had a pause rather than a change of behaviour. We've seen the scale of the climate, of the change of behaviour that's required. I don't think that actually our solutions are going to come from individual behaviour change. I think that's an important, but actually probably quite a small part of the equation. I think it's going to come from engineers, and it's going to come from financiers. Engineers figuring out new technology and solutions that allow us to live our life in a way more or less how it's been, and financiers to put money behind those to make them scale up. And I think there is, I like to be optimistic, so I think there is a kind of template for, the scale of operation that we've seen over COVID around the world, a real kind of, just an unprecedented global change, albeit temporary. And I think there will be some residual psychological lessons in that will come into play when we start coming out of this and changing the structures of society that have been less sustainable for the positive, for maybe more sustainable ones. And I think that's going to be driven by the fact that psychologically, for 20 years, we've had, oh yeah, the polar bears are dying, the planet's going to die, oh, it's all terrible, but nothing much we can do. And besides, my car's all right, and I live in a concrete, I live in a brick house, so I'm okay. I think, that psychology is changing. And I think now we are, especially coming out of COVID, we're realizing we are a human animal that lives in the natural world, and we're not immune to these kind of threats. So I think, there is, I think we're in a more fertile ground for change than we were 2 years ago.
Yeah, it's a positive place to be, hopefully, which is good news. I'm going to let Gordon address the question you asked it, actually, in terms of businesses maybe being a bit more less excited, I suppose, about travelling around. Is it still sustainable for you?
Just before that, I'm delighted to be called an environmentalist by an environmentalist. But Andy's understanding of going to be driven by finance and engineers is, I think he's the business guru now. So it's fantastic.
We've had a swap, a complete swap. I love it.
Look, we don't, like my first point, we don't know what the pattern's going to be. I think inevitably, you've got to look at different parts of what is business travel. It's not one thing. So will people, huge numbers of people in Edinburgh go to London for 3 or 4 days a week? Every week. Will that happen in the short term? No, because actually corporate policies are not to travel. And they're going to like the savings that represents. They're not going to want to put that money back in the system again. But that being said, from my perspective, if you only go for 1 day, it's still 2 flights. So it might not have the hotel stuff. So there's going to be changes. But the other end of that spectrum, rather than people going off to see their internal colleagues, which they can clearly do on a Zoom call nowadays, we all do it. But I don't think you can replace the trip to China to open up the first conversation with an airline or with another university or whatever. Because I think at the end of the day, business is only ever interpreting cultures and about doing business in the way of the locality. And I think there is no replacement for personal interactions and understandings and collaborations. I mean, we all say that Zoom works, and it clearly does, as does Teams. But my God, we would rather not have to do it anymore, wouldn't we? I mean, so there is a huge joy and a creativity that is done face to face that you just cannot replicate on video conferencing.
Yeah, so you think obviously business will change, but maybe not. It's not going to be a full shift to everything being digital.
Yeah, you can't go out and toast the deal on Zoom.
Very true, very true. I'm actually going to come back to you, Andy. We've got a few questions coming in here. Again, if anyone else wants to get involved in the conversation, we're a wee bit over time, but we're going to keep going because I think there's some interesting points to be made here. We've got a question in from Gordon McIntyre. He says, what an amazing journey and adventure. He wants to know, did you ever worry that you would get stuck in a remote area? But I think another good question environmentally here is, did you see a major climate agreement to be signed in Glasgow at COP26? Do you think there will be a big sort of policy shift in the sort of meeting at COP26 this year?
In terms of getting stuck, I had a 1,000-litre fuel tank, and every opportunity I got, I filled that up to the brim. So that gave me a big buffer. Some countries, very difficult to find oil. India, they don't actually throw away waste oil. They just keep cooking in it, which is actually really unhealthy. There's lots of carcinogens in the oil. Other countries, they don't have, in Southeast Asia, they don't really have a culture of fried foods so much, or shallow fried, not deep fried. So there were some places where it was really difficult to get oil. In Iran, I really struggled because actually diesel is 1 penny a litre. It was 1 penny a litre. And waste oil is used as a flavouring in soups. So there's no waste oil, but there's plenty of diesel. So there were times when it was really difficult, but because of this large buffer, I was able to sort of keep going. In terms of predicting the future of COP, I really hope so. I think there's an awful lot of things that are moving in the right direction. I think the sort of language coming from the Biden administration, obviously the US is going to be a big lead, but China too, the language coming from China and the concrete steps that are coming from China. I mean, just recently they kind of the Chinese brought their targets forward, which I think left everybody really on the back foot, because there's this narrative that, the Chinese, they're just about polluting and they don't care about the environment. Of course, that's not true. They see the future just as well as we do. So I think, I think the mood music's very different now than it was certainly under the Trump regime, and even before that, under Obama, there was maybe less urgency. And we'll see. I mean, the hard work's going on now in advance. So when they all sit down and sign the agreements. That that's the sort of showpiece at the end. I think there will be. I think Biden's talked a lot about the Green New Deal and the green economy, and I think he has an obligation to deliver that for the Rust Belt. And I think that's going to set a global example. And I think we'll see some really interesting things. The other thing is that, ironically, through the pandemic, money seems to be no object now. We've kind of just thrown away any kind of fiscal responsibility in terms of how much we borrow. So the gates are open. We borrowed so much to deal with the pandemic. Then what's another 10% to create new green infrastructure economies? It's So I'm pretty optimistic, but who knows? You're always optimistic going into these things.
Yeah, no, I'd actually like to get Gordon's thought on this as well with sort of COP26. What do you foresee happening? Do you think it will be positive?
Yeah, I think so. I think the needle has moved, and I reflect on. I think the American shift is huge. I think that is an enormous change, and I agree with Andy. I think China is going to be a leader in the technology. I got shown around the new Beijing airport about 2 years or 3 years ago now. And the entire airport is completely green and all powered by a solar farm that's about twice the size of the airport round about it. I mean, it's an absolutely astounding bit of engineering and phenomenal future-looking kind of concept that's going into there. And I think, what you got to remember is China has basically, has reproduced our industrial change that took us 100 years in about 10. And they are doing things at 10 times the pace on technology in general. So, putting aside all of all the political and the human rights issues, which are obviously massive, but China's motivation to get the environmental stuff right is actually probably bigger than ours, because they have got so much more to do around urbanization and around bringing a much bigger population up to a middle class standard, if you want to call it that, that they actually have a much higher necessity to address this environmental stuff. So I think we'll see that. They'll make mistakes as we did, but on the whole, they have got huge momentum behind that.
Yeah, I think the momentum is building across globally. I think that is the conversations there. People want it, and I think more people are aware of it as well. So hopefully progress will continue to keep getting made. Got another question in from Alison for you, Andy. Did you see any amazing or surprising environmental ideas on this journey around the world, any that could be used or amended for future here? Did you see anything sort of happening in an environmental sense, I suppose, any products or anything, sort of any ideas that should be rolled out across sort of the world?
Yeah, I mean, if there's any sort of panacea that was, tucked away in the corner of the world, we'd all know about it by now. I mean, there were a few projects in Mali. There was a project to make biodiesel using a plant called jatropha, which is a desert flower. It grows in marginal land. So one of the big problems with the agri-fuels is that the economic model encourages people to chop down rainforest in order to grow oil-based plants to make fuel, and from a carbon perspective, that's actually terrible. It's more than counterproductive. It's terrible. And so the idea of planting jatropha in marginal land, which you're not, it's desert basically. You're not chopping down anything else. You're not replacing food crops to grow it, but you get an oil yield out of it, is quite an interesting idea. There were some kind of attempts to make that scalable. Actually, in the end, the productivity is not brilliant, and people realize, if we grow jatropha on good land, then we get much more yield from it. So that kind of undermines the technology a little bit. But I think more than that, I think the lesson I came away with is that there's standards of living that we all kind of ascribe to, and the idea of making sacrifices because they are unsustainable brings down our standard of living. And by standards of living, I'm talking about the big TV, the car, the whatever. But there's also quality of life. And, not only am I going to sound like a tree hugger now, but I'm going to sound like a hippie too. Quality of life is a different thing. And actually in a lot of communities where you find they have a low standards of living, so they don't have the TV and they don't have all the gadgets that we think are so important. Actually, the quality of life and the interaction between people is just so much more rewarding and so much more valuable. And listening to myself, I just know exactly. I can hear the eyes rolling because I sound like my own eyes are rolling at myself. But I think there is a real lesson there to sort of think about how consumerism has driven us into aspiring to certain living standards because we think that's where success and happiness lies, and actually there are other things that we can be doing in our lives that don't involve consumption but that bring us a more fulfilling type of happiness.
Yeah, no, I think that is nicely summed up. It's about looking after the quality of life, and that doesn't always mean having more things, that materialistic sort of desire that I think is there in a lot of people. I'm aware that we are sort of getting past our time now, so I'll maybe ask just both of you one more question, because I'd actually love to speak to both of you for the rest of the day. But Andy, just if people have been sort of inspired by your journey, what would you say to them if they do want to either sort of up their sustainable living and maybe follow a bit more in your footsteps in terms of exploring the world? How is that possible? How do you make that possible?
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about sort of ecotourism, and he just kind of quite rightly came back and said, ecotourism is an oxymoron, right? So, and I think that's absolutely true. And I guess what I've tried to do in my trips is to travel sustainably, full stop, is quite difficult, but to travel more sustainably is something you can aspire to. And I think to travel with a purpose. So the idea of just traveling for the sake of consuming travel, I think there's a real ethical question that you need to ask yourself. Do I need to go to Barcelona for the weekend to look at some museums? And maybe you do. I'm not saying I'm not making a judgment. I'm just thinking, I'm trying to frame the question. And so that's something that's kind of crept into the trips that I've done, that now more and more, unless there's a sort of purpose beyond me getting to take a great selfie in front of something, then it doesn't feel like it's worthwhile travel, and there isn't the sort of justification that goes with it from a sustainability point of view. So those two things: travel more sustainably, because ecotourism is an oxymoron, and try and travel with a purpose. Make the travel benefit society in a way that compensates for the unsustainable elements of it.
Yeah, brilliant. Andy, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and obviously
sharing
pleasure. Your story. It's been wonderful, a treat to have you on. Thank you very much. We'll let you head back to your boat. Thank you again. And Gordon, I just want to finish off here. I kind of suppose touching on what has just been said there. Will we see tourism and aviation return to what it was before? Do you think it's going to change? Do you think we will get back to what we were?
I think it's always changing. I mean, the patterns of travel change all the time. We had the revolution of low-cost airlines that made it accessible to so many people. I mean, I think Andy's point about, what is the purpose of travel is really important. But don't denigrate the fact, my postman, who I talk to, about the only person I see in person these days, sort of like goes on about, when am I going to get my 2-week holiday again? And for him, that is the absolute focus of his entire year, is taking his family for a 2-week holiday on the beach in Spain. I don't think we should denigrate that. That's really important. I think Andy's points about, systemic change in the economy and everything else is going to be a big driver of that, and the technology. But also, we do have personal choice. I'm probably a little bit more positive about the role of personal choice. And I'm going to deliberately put in a really tongue-in-cheek example about personal choice. The carbon footprint of owning a middle-sized dog is the same as a return trip to Bangkok on a jet every year.
Really?
I don't have a dog.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it, absolutely. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much for your time and your insights, Gordon. It was fantastic. Well, I know we have very much run out of time, but thank you for your questions, for getting in touch, and for being part of the conversation today. It has been, I hope you will agree, very, very interesting indeed. I just want to say thank you, obviously, to Andy and to Gordon, our speakers today, to David for being with us, as always. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to all of our sponsors, Skills Development Scotland, Vision Events Glasgow, Red Unit, Recruit Genie, and Hilton Hotels. So thank you once again to all of them for making this possible. Thank you, of course, to you for watching, for getting involved with these webinars. It's great to have you with us. And just to remind you, obviously, these webinars are free. They will continue to be free. But if you do want to get involved to help with the resilience scholarships that hit Scotland, to help those adversely affected by the pandemic, and you are able to, you can donate that £10 by texting HIT-SCOT, HIT-SCOT to 785. Thank you very much in advance if you are able to do that and support that fund. I think that's it. I think we've run out of time, but make sure you visit the Hit Scotland website and register for next week's webinar. We've got Jonathan Humphreys, Head of International Hotel Development. We've got Mike Callahan, Director of Hunger App, and we've got Sophie Harding, the Futures Director of Mindshare UK as well. So that promises to be another fascinating hour ahead. But for now, and from all of us here in Glasgow, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.